I think we can all agree when I say that a lot can happen in 365 days. But as far as this movie's concerned, nah. The next 365 Days is a Polish erotic thriller based on the novel of the same name, and continues the story of Laura, a woman who has recovered from the events of the previous movie and is adjusting to married life with her husband Massimo. Despite this, she still thinks about her friend Nacho and the impact he had on her. Eventually, a rift forms in Laura and Massimo's relationship, and they have trouble overcoming their trust issues. Meanwhile, Nacho does his best to try and win over Laura's heart, leaving her to make a decision about which man she'll end up with. If this summary doesn't sound ridiculous, then frankly, I don't know what is. I don't think anyone expected going into this movie that it was gonna turn out good in any way, based on the previous movies anyway, but the complete and utter lack of inspiration behind this threequel is mind-boggling. Pretty much every single problem that was present in the past two movies are here once again. The only shocking revelation behind this movie is the absence of anything resembling a plot, so without any meaningful direction of where the story is supposed to go, we're essentially left with nothing. Laura was already an infuriating character in the previous movie, but after this, my patience for her has all but evaporated. It's impressive that she's meant to be the victim of all these terrible things that keep happening to her, yet she's easily the worst character in the entire series. To begin with, it baffles me that the filmmakers, once again, completely hand-waved the ending of the previous movie and mostly ignored that it ever happened. All that's revealed is that she has a scar on her lower abdomen, and like with her car accident, she recovers from her condition with little more than a scratch. Despite having been kidnapped, drugged, threatened, and sexually assaulted by her husband, suffering a miscarriage, surviving a car accident, and a gunshot, she has zero trauma from anything that's happened to her and continues living life like it's no big deal. I don't think there are enough words in the dictionary that could adequately describe how disgusting the way her character's handling is here. The movie squanders every single opportunity it has to give more emotional depth to her character, leaving her as nothing more than a soulless sex machine. The movie does attempt to make her more interesting from a dramatic perspective, but as you can imagine, it handles it in the worst way possible. Her entire world falls apart for the most shallow and self-absorbed reasons, and before getting into these reasons, it's important to take a look at the other characters first. Massimo is still as boring as he was in the last movie, though I will give some credit where it's due, and that his actor tries his best to give him some degree of personality this time around. He clearly mourns the loss of his brother from the last movie, and this actually succeeded in making me sympathize with him just a little bit. Like I said though, there's just not that much to him as a character. He doesn't even appear as often as one might expect, largely disappearing for most of the second act, and his history with the Mafia remains vague up to the very end. He almost felt like a ghost with how much he disappears and reappears, so I couldn't be bothered to get invested in whatever struggle he went through. The relationship between him and Laura is still as superficial as it ever was, but this time around it feels more sinister. The movie continues to glamorize and promote their toxic dynamic as being erotic and fulfilling, but for a much different reason than just simply kidnapping a woman and making her a sex slave. Nothing that these two are involved in resembles anything that a healthy relationship would have. They continue hiding things from each other and argue about things like Laura's pregnancy and Massimo lying over his twin brother, which are issues that have long since been resolved, and yet they continue beating them like the dead horses they are. Everything about the relationship was passive-aggressive to the point of being comical. There was one scene that shocked me in this regard, in which Massimo storms past Laura like a kid whose balloon got popped, and he actually throws his glasses on the ground as he power walks past her. As always, the huge tonal shifts in between scenes make the relationship a complete joke. One moment they'll be having sex, and in the next they'll have a big argument over something so minor that it makes one question how they've been able to go this long as a couple. And this goes back to what I said earlier. The biggest reason why they don't work well together at all is simply because they don't behave like normal human beings. Instead of hashing things out in a mature conversation, they behave like children and plot revenge against each other. And all this drama revolves around one person, Nacho. Just like with the last movie, Nacho is pretty much pointless as a character beyond being another meathead boy toy for Laura to play with. But unlike his last appearance where he was simply just boring, here his character treads the borderline of being uncomfortably creepy despite his good intentions. His attraction to Laura makes absolutely no sense. The two of them spent a total of 2 days being around each other without either of them learning all that much about the other, but apparently that's enough for him to declare that he loves her. I mean, yikes. There's something profoundly disturbing about the lengths Nacho goes to insert himself into Laura's life and declaring his love for her. If it were any other average Joe, a woman like Laura would get creeped out and just walk away, rightfully so. Yet because he's attractive, we're supposed to think that his behavior is okay? Laura's not entirely blameless from this situation either. Her fixation on Nacho is just as baseless, as she keeps obsessing over him in weird dream sequences and even when she has sex with Massimo, despite never having had sex with Nacho. Fantasizing is one thing, but to fall in love with him is a pretty big stretch, to put it mildly. And this goes back to what I hinted at earlier about Laura's shallow reasons for doing what she does. When Laura splits from Massimo, she does this under the excuse that, in her words, she needs more time to figure out what she wants. First of all, Laura's relationship with Massimo is incredibly one-sided. There's a point in the movie where she mocks him for needing space away from the drama, yet apparently it's okay for her to take a time out for the entire second act. The sheer hypocrisy of her words is so bewildering that it's almost painful. Second, Laura claims that she wants to save her relationship with Massimo, but her actions don't reflect what she says. Instead, she does the complete opposite, immersing herself in work, spending as much time with her friend Olga as possible, and generally avoiding Massimo whenever she can. For someone who claims to want to save the relationship, it's pretty funny to see her run away from it so much. Third, Laura pulls off the exact same "I need more time" line with Nacho, which would make sense if she didn't fantasize about him so much. She has her way with him, keeps him on the hook, and goes back to Massimo, pretending that she didn't just cheat on her husband. There's just something about how manipulative she is with these two that makes me sick. Fourth, I don't know how much more time she could possibly need. The amount of time she spent with Massimo in the first movie alone would have been more than enough time to figure out that maybe, just maybe, getting married to a rapist kidnapping mafioso isn't a good idea. I mean, how much time are we talking about here? 1 day? 2 days? 365 days? Fifth, and this is a pretty simple point, she has no idea what she wants. After spending so much time with Massimo and Nacho, she still can't commit to a specific direction. She just wanders around aimlessly creating drama wherever she goes. I can't for the life of me understand how the audience is supposed to care about her. And I'm not saying that the other characters are sympathetic. Massimo, for the record, is a total scumbag. I'm just saying that after everything Laura has gone through, she still hasn't learned anything. And her disgusting behavior in this movie in particular makes her one of the worst protagonists I've seen in recent years. Well, now that I'm done ranting about the story at large, it's time to talk about the little things that make this movie so bad, starting with the sex. As with the other movies, it's pretty much the only reason to watch this one, and as per usual, the sex scenes are mind-numbingly boring to watch. Apart from 2 scenes that actually attempt to be unique, one of them being a pretty spicy threesome scene, it's the same as it's always been. 3 to 4 minute segments of vanilla sex, showing Laura moaning and gyrating with whatever man she feels like being with. It's hilarious to see so much sex present in these movies, yet it completely lacks any sort of erotic tension. The cutaways and flashbacks that are used during the sex and romance scenes make them even more unbearable than they already are. Every now and then, the movie uses static jump cuts within the same scene, which is really distracting, while the flashbacks are odd with how they recall seemingly insignificant moments from previous movies and make Laura out to be severely affected by them. The large amount of pop music that plays both in and outside of these sex scenes is another thing to be expected at this point. While the songs themselves are okay for the most part, it's still absurd to hear so much of it in one movie, and it continues to clash with the tone of scenes at times. I noticed that when there's supposed to be dialogue, the music often plays over and essentially mutes the scene. This was a pretty lazy way of masking out exposition that could have easily been explained in a few lines, and all it did in the end was stretch out the runtime longer than necessary. Returning along with the music are lengthy montages with various mundane tasks, ranging from shopping to dancing to just walking from point A to point B. Just like with the other movies, all of these montages did little more than waste valuable screen time, especially when combined with the never-ending music. Olga returns to support Laura in her struggles, and as always, she's pretty much worthless. Her assigned role as comic relief was bad enough in the last movie, but this one goes way overboard with her constant screaming and silly antics. There's an entire angle that centers around her getting drunk and trying to get into a party, and man, it was bad. I will give credit where it's due though. Olga does a great job at calling Laura out on her BS when she deserves it. There's a part in the movie where she questions why Laura is so obsessed with Nacho when she barely knows him. And when that happened, I couldn't help but cheer from my couch. I was like, yes, yes, yes! It almost felt like the screenwriter of that scene had a moment of clarity when they were making it, like they just realized she was a bad person this whole time. There's just something satisfying about seeing Laura getting raked over the coals for her behavior. It doesn't last long, but it's enjoyable while it does. Apart from occasional moments like this though, the acting is still as boring as ever, especially for Laura, whose actress couldn't be more disinterested if she tried. Her emotional reaction to certain events varies wildly throughout the story, as she cries over things that aren't all that bad, while being stoic over things that should be devastating. As if the acting wasn't bland enough, the actors still have a hard time reading their lines. One would think that after 3 movies that the actors would get a handle on their English and at least try to read them phonetically, but not only does this not happen, I actually think this is the worst movie for this issue. Some examples include step a foot into instead of step foot into, it would be easier way for you instead of it would be easier for you, and I didn't fall in love with you at the first sight, which I don't think I need to comment on. The best one by far is when Laura mispronounces the word speculating, which is indicated in the subtitles, and instead says spectaculating, which is just amazing. Other lines in this movie aren't exactly errors, but just made me laugh with how extreme their delivery was. Massimo takes the award in this area once again, bearing yet another catchphrase where he quietly builds up his words and then all of a sudden screams, "Liar!" This on top of his old lines appearing again like, "I have to go, I have some work to do," and "Are you lost, baby girl?" were pure comedy gold. The actors aren't the only ones that make mistakes. The filmmakers are just as much to blame for the state of this movie and the series at large. Continuity errors remain prevalent as ever, such as when Laura reveals to Olga who Nacho is, and out of nowhere Olga says that Laura only saw Nacho twice, which doesn't make sense because Laura never said how many times she saw him. The whole bit where Laura and Olga go to Portugal for a fashion show is riddled with continuity errors. Somehow Massimo has a hard time tracking down Laura to reason with her, yet has no problem sending a goon to look after Olga, who is in the exact same place as Laura. Most of these errors are more funny than anything else, but sometimes they are bad enough that they actually disrupt the pacing of the story. When Laura finishes her little getaway in Portugal with Nacho, she suddenly shows up in front of Massimo. It's not immediately clear if she's still in Portugal or not until much later, and it was extremely confusing to follow along. When the movie isn't being bogged down in drama, montages, or sex, some scenes are just straight up weird. An example of this is when Laura shows up to work at the clothing company, which I'm amazed the movie even remembered it exists, and she walks into a room where her coworker is casually having sex with some random dude. Not only is the sex scene itself out of place since these two characters have nothing to do with what happens in the story, but it gets even weirder once the sex is over. Laura and the other girl, who's virtually naked by the way, just stand around having a casual conversation, as if what just happened is an everyday normal occurrence. The only scene that actually resonated with me on some emotional level was when Laura took the chance to visit her parents in Poland. It's the one time where the movie takes a break from its insanity and actually allows for some level of character development for Laura to proceed. Even then though, the scene isn't perfect. Laura declares to her parents that she's in love with another man, that man being Nacho, and it brings everything back to square one, which is funny because, as I mentioned before, she doesn't really know what she wants. Beyond everything else I've mentioned already, the movie is just so dull and boring to sit through. I wasn't kidding when I said that the plot is pretty much non-existent. All it is a lame love triangle, featuring an indecisive airhead, a kidnapping rapist mafioso, and the world's least convincing gardener. That's it. There's no real stakes at play in this movie's story. At least with the first movie, the Mafia had a bigger presence, and in the second movie there was the angle with Massimo's twin brother. Both of these plots were stupid, but at least they were there. I genuinely felt lost the entire time I was watching this movie. It almost feels like an episode of some trash reality TV show stretched into a 2-hour time frame if it were filmed by pornographers. Anything that could even slightly hint at some semblance of story structure has been watered down to a point where it just does not exist. And I can think of no better segue to connect this point to than the ending. Simply put, the movie doesn't end. Not really anyway. Things are purposely left open to suggest a possible sequel in the future, which I find unusual considering this was supposed to be based on a book series that did in fact end. But even if a sequel did happen, then it begs the question, what is there left to tell? There's so little that happens between Laura, Massimo, and Nacho in this movie, it's as if their story shouldn't even have been told in the first place. I certainly can't imagine another 365 days of this nonsense playing out. By the way, in case you're wondering, the title Next 365 Days doesn't have anything to do with the story. There's no actual time interval in the movie at all. None of the characters keep track of it other than passing moments of dialogue. So like the previous sequel, it's just a fancy title that means nothing. It's bad bad enough that this whole love triangle is so vapid, lifeless, and just lacking in substance, but to botch this series so badly by combining it with toxic messages and meaningless filler makes me wonder if the filmmakers actually intended on sabotaging this from the beginning and turning it into a torture exercise. That's definitely a lot more believable than accepting anything that happens in the series at face value, even as just a fantasy. Passing these movies off as just erotic smut is not an excuse to ignore artistic merit, especially when there's already so many people out there that unironically enjoy these movies and are easily impressionable with their messages. I know this video has gone on for a long time now, so I'm gonna finish on this point. I truly believe that movies like these are harmful, not just to the film industry, but to society in general. Media has a powerful effect on people, and I'm worried that movies like this will give people the wrong idea of what to expect in relationships and will foster acceptance of abusive behavior. Maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I'm looking too much into it, but I just can't shake the feeling of how exhausted and nasty I felt when watching this movie, and the series in general. It has a tempting mask that hides something horrible within its work, and whatever it is, I want no part in it. Overall, the next 365 days is a terrible excuse of cinematic filth that has no inkling of a reason to exist. The only people I could possibly imagine enjoying this movie are sadists who enjoy punishing themselves with hate-watching movies. Something makes me wonder how they might react to a BDSM version of this movie, but I don't want to give the filmmakers any ideas. I'm genuinely stunned that I could even bring myself to finish the series, assuming that a fourth movie doesn't come out. But at the same time, I'm so relieved that I don't have to experience it anymore, at least hopefully. 3 movies is far more than this franchise has and will ever deserve. What did you think about this movie? Did you hate it as much as I did, or were you somehow able to find redeeming factors to it? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of the next 365 days. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the American miniseries Lost Ollie. Bye bye!